Okay, well, why don't we get started? I'm excited to have Alex Huth here. We've been trying to get him scheduled for a talk for a while. Alex has spent a lot of time in California. He was an undergrad at Caltech, I think, is that right? And then did his PhD at Berkeley in neuroscience. And he has a joint appointment here at UT in computer science and neuroscience. And he works on how the brain represents anything and everything, or specific things that he'll talk to us about, and its relationship to computation. And so we're really excited to understand how that fits in to some interesting problems from machine learning. That's what he's going to talk about today. So thanks for being here, and let me turn it over to you.
Cool. Thanks so much, Adam. It's good to see y'all here. It's been a long time since I've seen many of you in person. So yeah, I'm looking forward to catching up with everyone once we do that again. And I apologize in advance. I'm in an Airbnb with my dog, who may yowl at any moment if there's unexpected sounds, and everything is unexpected here since we're not at home. So please bear with me if that happens. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about a line of work that's been going on in my lab related to the timescales of representation in language and in the brain, and how we can relate these things. So let me dive in here. So no, I take a step back. Before I dive in, I want to say a little bit about the people who have done all this work. The work I'm going to talk about today is this really a result of like a long-running collaboration between my lab and the brain-inspired computing lab at Intel, who I've been working closely with. In my lab, the work I'm talking about is mostly done by grad students, Shimangi Mato, who just graduated with a master's in 2020, Shaylee Jain, who is a current PhD student, and Amanda LaBelle, who was my research assistant and is now a grad student at Berkeley. And we did all this work in close collaboration with these people at Intel, Vivo, Nicole Beckage, and Javier Tarek. All right, let's talk about the actual science. So if you're listening to language, if you're reading language, if you're understanding language, you need to remember things at many different timescales. So let's take this little passage as an example. We drove to the pizza shop to pick up our order. Then I dropped Wendy and the food off at the park. She would greet the guests there and make sure they were fed while I fetched the other supplies. Planning this party drove me nearly crazy, but it was worth it. Not hard to follow, like pretty straightforward. But in order to understand this, we need to remember things in several different ways. So there's some long timescale information. There's this kind of topic information. So you get the gist of this paragraph is that there's a party at a park somewhere. That's kind of the overall like gestalt. There's some medium timescale like co-reference information, right? So when I said the food, we know that actually corresponds to pizza here because we just had heard that word a moment ago. When we use a pronoun like she, that probably refers to Wendy, who just showed up here before. So linking these pieces of information together requires memory at maybe a slightly shorter timescale, or integration at a slightly shorter timescale. And then at like very short timescales, individual words can be used in different ways, right? So this word drove, like in this first sense, we drove to the pizza shop. This clearly means like, operating a motor vehicle. While in the second example, planning this party drove me nearly crazy. This is a more metaphorical, usage of the word drove. And, we need to sort of use the context in which this word occurs, which is probably related to the words that come right around it, to figure out like what these words actually mean. So the point here is that there are these multiple different timescales of information in language that we need to exploit in order to understand it. So what I'm going to talk about today is exploring this question and related questions through these several lines of research. So one of the basic questions that we want to ask here is how much of each timescale, like how much long timescale, how much medium timescale, and how much short timescale information do we need to understand language? Do we need to like process language effectively? how can we build a computational model that explicitly captures these timescales? And finally, do different brain areas handle different timescales of information? And can we use these computational methods that we're developing to actually try to answer that question? All right, so let's dig into this first one first. How much of each timescale do we actually need? So to try to answer this question, we started by looking to sort of theoretical work on what actually is the kind of statistical structure of language. And this is a very kind of broad, like simple question in some ways, is just like of all the information that's contained in a language signal, so of all the the bits of information that you gain from each word in language, how does that information relate to earlier information or information from like farther in the past? So there's been a fair bit of work on this, and there's this very nice paper from Max Tegmark's group at MIT, where they argue that the mutual information between words, so just if you know what this word is, how much information do you have about what this other word is in natural language, so in like real English language, tends to decay as a power law with the separation of those words. So if we plotted this mutual information here, we might see something like this. This is normalized, not a real metric. But on the x-axis here, we have the separation between two words. 0 means that they're the same word. 100 means that they come 100 words apart. And on the y-axis, this is the roughly the amount of some proportional to the amount of mutual information between those two words. And what they show in this paper is that this is fairly well modeled by a power law. So something like t to the minus d, if t is the separation and d is some constant. So what we typically do with power laws is we're going to plot them like this. So instead of just plotting linearly, we're going to plot them in log-log space. So on the x-axis here, we have log separation, and on the y-axis, log mutual information. This is the same thing, but now power laws show up as straight lines in this log-log space. Okay, so this is a hint of like how much information there is at different timescales. In general, there's a lot of information that's shared between words at short timescales and relatively little at long timescales. So how can we actually build this into a model, right? So in the kinds of models that we deal with in my group, we're mainly working with like recurrent neural network models, specifically these long short-term memory LSTM models. In these types of models, really memory tends to decay exponentially. So that means that there is not necessarily a fixed rate of decay of memory, but that memory, the decay rate can change over time, but in the long run, memory tends to operate in these networks as if it decays exponentially. So there's a really lovely analysis of this in this paper by Telek and Olivier that we build a lot of our work on. So if we try to look at this in the same kind of log-log space, this is what exponential decay of information would look like. So here we have log separation on the x-axis, and again, log whatever mutual information on the y-axis. If we have an exponential decay, then you'll notice that these numbers very quickly go to be very, very extremely small. And this curve doesn't really look like this straight line, right? Power laws are not exponential decay. This is a fundamental thing. But this is a problem for us because we want to approximate something that looks like this with something that acts like this. So how do we do this? How do we attack this?
Hey, Alex.
So yeah.
How do you measure the mutual information between words?
Yeah, so what you can do, what they did in this paper was essentially just build like a contingency table. So if you have some vocabulary size, then you can say, for some separation, let's say 5 words, you build a table that's like vocabulary by vocabulary, and say, what is the, given that, the word time t was this, what's the probability distribution over the word at time t minus 5, for example. And then the mutual information is going to be related to essentially the entropy of this whole table.
Okay.
Right? If if all these rows were like uniform, if they were all flat, then there'd be no mutual information. And if they were all delta functions, then there'd be a lot of mutual information.
Right.
Sorry.
They're estimating the joint distribution between word I and word J by taking samples from text, I suppose, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But the problem is, I guess the question is, that's a high dimensional distribution that we're approximating with a histogram. But I guess it's reasonable as a first approximation.
Yeah. So there's a lot of work in this paper, in the Lennon Mark paper, to I apologize, on like regularizing this mutual information estimate and trying to get it so that it makes sense even in cases where you're obviously undersampling this space wildly, right? So that's, yeah, we're not dealing with that like very directly here, but that is something that's a big concern for sure. All right, sorry for the barking dog. Okay, so again, our question here is kind of like, we know that this kind of acts like a power law, but we're trying to build it out of things that look like exponentials. How can we do this? 1 second, I'm sorry. So what, I'm so sorry. What we found here in this,
maybe you have some like treats or a bone you can.
I do. I am holding treats in front of her nose right now. That is how I'm solving this problem. So what we found and what we ended up publishing in this paper at iClear this year was that we can, of course, approximate this power law distribution, or this power law decay effect through a combination of exponential decays, right? And we derived theoretically like what this should look like. And it turns out that it has a fairly simple form. If you assume that there is a limit in terms of at short time scales, like what is it? There is a shortest time scale, then sorry. What we find is that this distribution needs that we need a combination of exponential timescales that looks like an inverse gamma distribution. Now, this is just a purely theoretical result. So this comes from saying, if we want to make a power law curve, this like t to the minus d, out of a combination of things that look like e to the minus something, then we need this specific combination of them to do that. So what this looks like is, we have this inverse gamma distribution. That means that we should have a lot of short timescale memory, or a lot of memory at this, around like a timescale of 1 in this case. Some medium timescale memory, so some that's sort of out in this slightly longer range, and a little but very, very long timescale memory, right? So out here we have this heavy tail of exponential decays that are themselves very long, but we have very few of them. Okay. So this was like the basic sort of theoretical finding in this paper, that we can approximate this power law using this specific mixture of exponential timescales. But how do we actually turn this into a computational model, or how do we embed this information into a computational model? So the basic tool that we're using here is an LSTM, long short-term memory language model. So this is an autoregressive neural network model that predicts the next word given the previous words in a piece of text, right? So it's approximating this probability distribution, the probability of word t given words 1 through t minus 1. And it does this in a sort of recurrent neural network way, right? So it propagates state forward, it receives the input word at each time point, and it outputs a predicted distribution, not really like a W hat, but actually this distribution over words. Now, one of the really nice things, and I want to mention the basic setup that we're using for this LSTM language model is the one from this paper by Merity et al., which is, I think, these models are not absolute state of the art in like language modeling these days. That's all about transformers. But transformers are much weirder in how they handle timescales. So we're sticking with these RNNs that I think are a little better understood. And this is essentially as good as LSTM language models have gotten as this Merity version. So, but the key thing here is that we want to be able to control these timescales within the model, right? We want to be able to control the amount of like long timescale information that we have and the amount of short timescale information that we have. And to do that, we're relying on the tools that come from this paper by Talek and Olivier. And the basic thing that they sort of tell us in this paper is that the timescale of an individual LSTM unit, so essentially the time over which that unit will hang on to information, will remember information, is controlled by essentially just a single parameter of the model, which is the bias of the forget gate in the model. So the forget gate is part of the LSTM that says how much of its memory should be essentially deleted at each time step, and the bias is setting what's the like average value. So how much on average is removed from the memory at each time step, which of course we can interpret as something like an exponential decay. So what this Talek and Olivier paper gives us is this tool for now controlling the timescales of individual units. All right, so what we do is we can now assign each unit in our language model a specific timescale. We can say like this unit needs to be short timescale, so we set it so that it has essentially a very negative bias on the forget gate. So the whatever the state is in that unit gets multiplied by a value that's close to 0 on every time step. That gives it a short timescale. It can't remember things for very long. Or we can assign it a very long timescale. So that's essentially setting the bias so that it forces the state, forces the forget gate to be close to 1 across all time, which will make it so that the unit is basically unable to forget any information. It's not multiplying the state by a number that's smaller than 1. So what we showed in this paper is that this tends to actually improve language modeling performance. So adding this information into the model makes the model better. It actually does better at its language modeling task, especially for long time scale information, which was kind of interesting. So it ends up that just training the model from scratch without this kind of prior built into it, it's very hard for the model to learn like very long timescale dependencies. They're weaker in general, right? There's less information there, but enforcing this structure on the model, adding this prior that there should be this specific distribution of timescales, actually makes it quite a bit better. What I don't mention here is that the model actually, if you don't enforce this, it does actually learn something that is surprisingly similar to this inverse gamma distribution. But it still improves a bit if we enforce that explicitly as a prior. So we're quite confident that this is like a good prior for how this model should work. Okay, now let's talk about how we can use this to actually model the brain. So I'm going to digress here for just a tiny moment. So there's been a lot of work in the past 3-4 years on building models of human brain processing, human language processing in the human brain, using features or representations extracted from neural network language models. So we had actually one of the first papers in this area, my student Shaylee did in 2018 at NeurIPS. But since then, there have been, I don't know, a dozen at least papers that are showing similar things and essentially trying different models. So whatever neural network language models are out there, GPT, GPT-2, GPT-3, et cetera, there's a wide profusion of these things. People have tried to use these to model brain data, and it's been very successful. They work really well. We don't really know why. And this is kind of a problem for our field. So we're stuck in this problem where we have these black boxy models that do a really good job at predicting human brain activity, but we don't know what it is about those models that's doing so well. And we don't really have good tools for interpreting those models. So we have a hard time taking a model that we fit and understanding what's going on. Yeah, Alex, what's up?
Sorry, I didn't understand. What exactly are we predicting, or you're going to talk about it?
I will talk about this. Sorry, I'm giving a digression here.
Okay.
Before I get to this point, I should have done this later. Yeah, I'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay. One of the nice things about what I'm going to tell you about right here is that this model that we're using, this what we call the multi-timescale LSTM language model, it has interpretability kind of built into it. It has this thing from the get-go, right? That we know something about each unit in the network. We know that this unit is long time scale and this unit is short time scale. We have that already assigned into the model. So this is going to help us in interpreting what we actually do with the model in a moment. Okay. So let's talk about what we're actually doing with the brain data. So the data that I'm going to show you is from natural language fMRI experiments. This is the kind of experiment that we do in my lab here at UT. We take human subjects, normal human subjects. I'm one of the subjects for this. I don't think that's my brain, but I might be one of the brains that you see here today. We put our subjects inside an MRI scanner and we have them just listen to stories, just listen to language. That's all. They're not doing any task. They're staying awake and paying attention. That's all they're doing. The stories they're listening to are good, normal, sort of natural stimuli. They're things that people might listen to anyway in their going about their lives. The data set that I'm going to show you today, I think, is all stories from the Moth Radio Hour. I don't know if any of y'all have heard about this. It's so the Moth is a storytelling theater in New York. They have the Moth Radio Hour, which is they take the best stories told by their storytellers and put them on the radio. KUT runs this, I don't remember, it's 7 p.m. on Sundays or something like that. So you can listen to it there and you hear just people tell good, interesting stories. They're stories you want to listen to. It's fun. It's fun. It's a fun experiment to be in. So while these people are listening to stories, we are scanning their brains. So we're recording these bold signals, the blood oxygenation signals from everywhere in their cortex. We get a whole brain snapshot every 2 seconds at the resolution of about 2.6 millimeters. So we're getting these 2.6 millimeter voxels. This is showing on the right just an illustration of kind of what one snapshot of the brain looks like in effect. Some areas have higher activity, some areas have lower activity. That's what we're dealing with. So what we're going to do here next is we want to predict the brain responses, right? We want to build a computational model where we can take the words of the story, we can take the words that the person is hearing, and we can predict how the brain is going to respond to those words. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to transform these words into some feature space and then use those features in a linear encoding model. So just in a linear regression model to predict the brain activity. So it looks kind of like this. In the middle here, we have the words of the story. So this is the words that the person is hearing. These are, of course, going into the human so that we can get their brain responses. We're measuring this response R. We're also feeding these words into our language model. So into this language model that we trained a moment ago to have these sort of fixed timescales. This model is it's reading these words as if it were doing its normal task. But instead of caring about what the model outputs, which we don't here, we are just taking the vector of activations from this model. So we're saying what are the artificial neurons doing inside this LSTM language model? We're extracting these vectors of activations, and then we're using them to predict the brain activity. So our regression model looks something like this. We have the response at time t, and we're approximating that as a weighted sum of essentially the activations of each of these units at time t. So we have 1,150 units here, n is 1,150 in our case, and we're just doing a linear regression here. So we're fitting a separate weight for each unit. That's these betas here. So we can fit this on most of our data. We have about 6 hours of data that we're using to fit these models. And then we're going to test it on another bit of data after we do that to see like how well it actually works. Yeah, so right, these betas are the unknowns here. So we're estimating those using ridge regression, just L2 regularized regression. All right. So once we have these models, we can start to do things with them. We can ask these questions about, what time scale of information is represented by each part of the brain, or what, essentially like what, which units in the language model is each part of the brain sort of responding to or similar to, and what are the timescales of those units. So here what I'm showing is this is 2 different voxels. So we fit a separate model for each voxel in the brain. That's each of these, it's the 3D version of a pixel, and that's the smallest unit that we measure with fMRI. So here's just 2 different voxels that we're able to predict pretty well using this model. And what we're showing is for each of the 1150 features in our model, what is the absolute value of the weight on that feature after our regression. So you can see that this voxel on the top here, it has a lot of weight on these kind of short time scales. It has a little bit of weight on these long time scales as well, but it has a lot of weight on the short time scales. Whereas this voxel on the bottom, it has a lot of weight on these sort of medium to long time scale units, right? So it's really seeming to respond more to the stuff that's in these units that have longer time scales. So how can we kind of summarize this information into just a measure of like what's the like average time scale in each voxel? So we do that by computing this measure we call TV here, which is we're essentially just taking the center of mass of these values, right? So we're taking the sum of the squared weights multiplied by the time scale of each weight divided by just the sum of the squared weights. And this gives us a measure of like what is the mean time scale of the information that this voxel is selected for. And this is something that was published in Shaley's NeurIPS paper last year. All right, so now we can look at this across the brain, right? We can ask, what I showed you a moment ago was for 2 voxels, but we have many more voxels than that. In each subject's cortex, we have something like 50 to 80,000 voxels. What we're showing here is only the voxels that were very well predicted by our model. So at the bottom here, I'm showing a histogram of the prediction performance. So this is like out of set prediction performance for each voxel. We have, you can see there's, of course, most of the brain, most of the voxels in the brain have low prediction performance because they don't really care about these stimuli. Voxels in visual cortex, voxels in motor cortex, the subjects aren't seeing anything and they're not moving. So of course, there's going to be nothing happening there. But there's this heavy tail of voxels that we can predict quite well, out to about a correlation of 0.6 between predicted and actual responses. On this brain map up here, we're only showing the well-predicted voxels. All the poorly predicted ones are just shown in this like underlying gray color. And we've colored each voxel according to what its best timescale is. And here we've actually converted the numbers into seconds instead of being in words. But essentially, so we have very short timescale representations here in the auditory cortex, in the sort of input to the language system. And then moving out from auditory cortex, we see some intermediate timescale representations out to much longer timescale representations in like the anterior temporal lobe, in the precuneus, and in the prefrontal cortex, which are these much higher level brain areas that we have been led to suspect by earlier work are extracting higher level representations of language. Sorry, Alex, do you have a question?
Me? Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of do, but I don't know how you could tell. Did I?
You unmuted yourself. It was
unmuted myself. Yeah. So I guess the one question I had is the timescales go. So the short ones is in the order of less than 4 seconds up to 14. Are you training on how are you splitting for each voxel? You do a train test split, so you split the voxel into the past and the future. and then you see how well your regression fits using the LSTM as features, if I understood correctly?
Yeah. I mean, it's past and future. So, I mean, we have a set of like, the way that we record the data is somebody just listens to a story in like one fell swoop, and that's one of our recordings. So this is like 10 or 15 minutes of data. We have a set of 27 of these stories that are our training set, and we have one that's our test set in this case.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah, so like totally separate test set. We're not, it's not even the same story, like different words, different speaker, everything's different.
I see. And it's able to track, the LSTM is able to track the voxel activation in the timescale of a minute, you say?
Well, so does it track the activation? So what we're saying here is that to say something like that, I think we'd have to do a slightly different analysis, which would be like looking at the like coherency between our predicted the predicted response and the actual response, right? Because then we could say like, how well are we predicting the responses at, whatever, 0.5 hertz? How well are we doing at 0.2 hertz? How well are we doing at 0.01 hertz, et cetera, right? Coherency gives us this like, measures of prediction performance at different frequencies. We're not doing that here. We're just computing the overall prediction performance. The timescale measure here is coming from using the information that we have about our LSTM, right? So using this information that we know that like, some units are short timescale and some units are long timescale, to create this measure of like what timescale this voxel is integrating information over. That doesn't necessarily mean that the voxel has to have, slowly changing responses. Practically, that is what happens, though.
Yeah. So you have created some short time features and long time features from the LSTM, if I understand correctly, and you're saying that these are the ones that are used in the prediction, but more.
Yes.
So to speak.
Yes. Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah, and again, we can do this very well, right? So the correlations of like 0.2 to 0.4. This doesn't seem great. fMRI data is an awful, like noisy mess in general. So these correlations are, the fact that we can get out to 0.6 is surprisingly good in some circles. Whatever. All right. So this was our first kind of finding from this, is that we can use this now interpretable model to infer something about these brain areas, something that's not just like that this model fits well, which is essentially what the field had gotten to before, but actually saying that like, these parts of the brain are responding to long timescale features and these parts of the brain are responding to short timescale features. So how does this line up with things that people have found before? So this is, we are not the first people to ask this question of, what are the sort of timescales of representation in the brain? We are the first to do it the way that we have, but there have been studies on this before. And this is the most famous one. So this is from Uri Hassan's group at Princeton. It's by Yulia Lerner. This is a fabulous study, like one of my favorite studies in neuroscience. It's just like a very beautiful experimental design. It's very clean. What they did is, so they actually manipulated their stimuli. So they took a story very similar to what we did, and then they scrambled it at different scales. So they either broke it up into paragraphs and scrambled the paragraphs, broke it up into sentences and scrambled the sentences, broke it up into words and scrambled the words, or just played it literally the whole thing backwards. And then they looked at which parts of the brain would respond reliably in each of these conditions, right? So the theory being like, if you have a very long time, a brain area that is sensitive to like long time scale structure, then if you scramble at, say, the scale of words, you're going to break up the information that that brain area cares about, and that brain area is going to stop responding reliably. To estimate which brain areas are responding reliably, they needed to do this kind of, messy thing, which is actually map between subjects. So they play the same stories for different subjects and then look at the correlation between these brain areas between different people. This ends up being a challenge because you have to blur things a lot to make them match across people, which is something a problem that we don't have because we're doing everything within individual subjects. But still, what they found in this study is this kind of hierarchy of timescales, what they argue, across especially temporal lobe and then these other parts of the brain as well. So here we have like short, not that short, medium, and long timescales as you move along this part of the temporal lobe. So one thing that we wanted to ask here is, given we have a result that says what the timescales are in different parts of the brain, they have a result that says what timescales are in different parts of the brain for language listening. How well do these things match? How well do they actually correspond to each other? So what we did, and this is actually, I think, very interesting from like a meta science perspective in terms of what we can do with the kinds of models that we're talking about here, is we simulated this experiment in silico. So we generated stimuli that look like their stimuli, right? That are scrambled at different scales. We just simulated how we think the brain would respond to these stimuli using the computational model that we built, using this like LSTM based encoding model, and then we did their same analysis. So when you do this, we end up with a very similar map, it turns out. So on the left here, this is our in silico replication of this model, of this result, where we again see, for example, this like short to not so short to medium to long, long-ish timescale representation across the temporal lobe, which is what they saw here. We also replicate the longer timescales in the prefrontal cortex and longer timescales in the precuneus, et cetera. Like broadly, these patterns match. But I think the critical thing here is, so in part, this like validates our approach. We're getting the same thing as sort of standard things in the field. But what's cool is that we didn't do this experiment, right? We never recorded fMRI data from our subjects while they did this experiment. This is wholly simulated based on natural stimuli. Which we can use to also simulate a bunch of other experiments. And in fact, that's what we're doing with this, this paper co-headed by Vivo and Shaylee Jane. We're using our models to replicate a bunch of different results, and it turns out that it works really well. So we're arguing here that like this approach of just building large-scale computational models of brain response to natural language is pretty sufficient for understanding all this other stuff that we want to know about the brain, right? You can do these kind of targeted analyses using the models that we fit. All right. So the final part of this that I want to mention, I guess I don't actually know how long I'm supposed to talk for, but I'm almost done. So I hope that's okay. So the final thing that we can do here is we can actually try to also figure out what types of information in language, if we try to think of this in linguistic terms, what types of information are captured by these different timescales, right? So we've discussed everything so far just in terms of like what is the timescale. There's short timescale and there's long timescale, and I started off by giving you some kind of vague direction of like the topic of a thing is something that comes from long timescale, and whatever part of speech is short timescale. I was not completely pulling that out of the ether. We are actually able to take this model and try to ask what kinds of different language properties are captured by these different timescales. So that's this analysis right here. This is basically a standard like probing analysis that people do in NLP, but just applied to this model where we have this, again, built-in sort of interpretable measure. So these plots on the right, these are showing how well we can do classification of different language features. So for example, how well can we classify parts of speech? How well can we do named entity recognition? Or how well can we classify like the topic of a piece of text? And on the x-axis here, this is showing either we use all the units in this network, or we only use units with specific timescales. So maybe we only use the very shortest timescale units, or we only use the very longest timescale units, or something in between. And so what we find is that for some of these properties, for like part of speech, it turns out that you get all the necessary information from the shortest timescale units. So essentially from these short timescales, this contains all the information about part of speech. So maybe this means that the parts of the brain that we found that were more responsive to these like short timescale representations, or contained more of these short timescale representations, we might also infer that they're more related to part of speech. That is something we can also test directly, but in this case, we're doing it sort of a post hoc inference. When we look at named entity recognition, which is finding kind of spans of text that are correspond to the names of places or people or whatever, there we found that actually the most information comes from these middle timescale units. Whereas if we look at narrative topic, so like what is broadly this piece of text about, there we find that the most information comes from the very longest timescale units. So these units that integrate over many, many, many words. These are the units that are driving this kind of topic level information. So the point here is just to show that we can, even though we've like built this network to be interpretable from the jump, we can even dissect it further to say what types of linguistic information are maybe contained or computed in these different segments of the network.
Did you only look at these three types of linguistic information? I mean, part of speech, named entity recognition, narrative topic. Aren't there other things that you can look at here?
Sure, yes. There are definitely other things. These all came from, we're kind of pulling this out of another paper that did a similar thing. So we just hit these for now. We've done more as well. These were the ones that were like most cleanly localized, which is why I'm showing them here as examples of like short, medium, and long. Cool. All right. So so that kind of wraps things up. Let me tell you a little bit about what we're concluding here. So the basic result that was kind of driving this is that we dug into like how do we replicate this power law distribution of information in natural language with exponentially decaying memory. And we found that we should use this specific inverse gamma distribution of exponential timescales. And that was from Shivangi's iClear paper. We built this LSTM language model with these specific timescales, and it predicts the fMRI data really well. Because this model, again, has this sort of interpretable component, that it's not a black box model anymore. It actually has like labels of what the different parts are doing. We can actually use that to estimate some quantity of interest, which is like what is the timescale of representation in each voxel, each part of the brain. And then going further, we can actually use this computational model to replicate previous experiments in silico. We don't have to like run these experiments. We get sort of the same information out of our setup. And we can go further and try to interpret what kind of information is contained in these different representations. So that covers these kind of three papers, two that are published and one that's in the process. I want to talk a little bit about like where we're going from here, like what are the kind of future directions building on this. One thing that we're very excited about is, so what I showed you here was, we're building these neural network language models on a bunch of text and then using them to predict the brain, right? So we're doing this as like a 1-2 punch, right? First you train on text, then you freeze the model and predict the brain data. But one question that we're really excited about is, can we learn these models directly from the brain data? Can we just build an end-to-end encoding model where the input is the words, the output is the brain activity, and in the middle we have an LSTM or a transformer. This is something that we're actively pursuing now. The thing that we think is the limiting factor is the amount of data that we have. Luckily, with my collaborator Leila Wahebi at CMU, we just got a grant to collect very, very, very large data sets. So we are going to be using that to try to build these end-to-end like direct neural network encoding models. A second question that we're actively working on is what can these models tell us about the selectivity of each brain area, right? So here I talked about like one specific quantity that we can measure, which is the timescale of the representation in each part of the brain. But that's that's a very impoverished sort of description of what each part of the brain is doing. There's a lot more that's going on there, right? So in Shaylee's current work, she's trying to do more to sort of dissect the selectivity that we see in these models to say like, what actually is it about language that's driving the response in each part of the brain? And this is ending up quite exciting. And then lastly, something that is getting very close to fruition and is extremely exciting is can we actually invert these encoding models to decode language from fMRI, right? So can we flip this around? So instead of predicting the brain activity from the words that came in, can we predict the words from the brain activity? This is something that my grad student, Jerry Tang, is working on. The paper is almost finished. I would show you results, but it's very exciting. This works astonishingly well. We can do a really good job at this. We can do okay even if like a person is imagining words and not hearing them spoken. This works across modalities. So if we have somebody just watch a movie, then we can actually decode sort of a stream of the events in the movie as language, which means there is some, what we're actually getting at here is some supramodal representation. And yeah, so this is very exciting and really is something that leverages these large data sets that we have. So this is broadly what we're, where we're headed with this next. So with that, I want to close and thank all the folks in my lab. I already mentioned Shaylee, Shivangi, and Amanda, who worked on this directly. My other grad students and undergrads in the lab are all, working on the infrastructure to support this kind of stuff. So everyone's kind of involved. Our collaborators at Intel Labs are deeply involved in this. So V, Nicole, and Javier on this project. Also Sherry Chen, Mihai Kapota, and Ted Wilkie, who runs the group there. And then, of course, our funders. And thanks to y'all for listening. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah. Anyone have any questions?
I guess I'll ask something, Alex. So you said it's hard to get timescale information from transformers, which I would tend to agree with, but you're using LSTMs here. I'm wondering, have you tried just replicating things with GRUs to show that this is like a general RNN phenomenon, or is it something specific about the, forget gate in the LSTM, or is it something a little broader?
So, we haven't tried this, but I would absolutely expect that this will replicate with GRUs. They're pretty equivalent to LSTMs in what they can do, right? That's sort of what I've seen. They have slightly fewer parameters, which means for the same number of units and the same number of layers, like they can do a little bit less. But if you kind of match the number of parameters and set the regularization correctly, they're essentially indistinguishable. This same mechanism of like controlling the timescale of each unit works just as well with GRUs as with LSTMs. They're both like gated recurrent neural networks. It is like that gating property that seems to be essential though, or at least like that's what the Telek and Olivier paper focused on. That's a really fabulous paper, by the way. That's like one of my favorite papers that I've read in years. They actually sort of rederive gated recurrent neural networks from first principles. They say like, if you just want an RNN to not operate at a fixed time scale, but to be able to operate at variable time scales to work with like warped time, how would you do that? They go through this analysis of like the timescales and essentially just from that derive what gated RNNs should look like. It's elegant, it's beautiful.
So if I may ask, if I understand, you've built like a text to fMRI predictor, right? Where the input is text, not audio, right? The input is actual text.
Right.
Yeah. So the input is actual text, and it spits out an fMRI prediction. I guess my two questions here is, the first one is, does it transfer across participants? So I understand you fine-tune this from the LSTM to the fMRI, but if I have a different person, does it transfer across participants? Is the first.
It does not, like absolutely not. We've been testing this quite a bit with, oops, I think that's gonna, yeah, with this decoding work. So testing like how well can those models like generalize across people. It's terrible. It's awful. What we're, there are broad patterns of things that are similar across people, but the specifics of what each voxel is doing, the specifics of each little 2 millimeter cube of brain tissue, that's the detail that's at that level is important enough that we just can't map across people easily. If we map across people, we're just losing far too much resolution. Right. Essentially, we have no reliable way to do that.
Then I guess going to my second question, which is kind of a general methodology that you already pointed to. So you have this very nice that you can in silico replicate fMRI studies, right? So I expect there's 1 million studies where people took grad students, they heard stories and stuff, and they scanned their fMRI scan. So if you can predict that in silico, that would save a lot of scanner money, first of all, and would also, of course, obviously would be an amazing model. But now if it doesn't transfer across participants, then you cannot, I guess you expect that there's some universality in the areas activated that your in silico will also discover the same phenomena as a study that says, oh, when I hear terror stories, this part of my brain activates, or when I hear these other stories, this part of my brain activates, or something.
Right. So I guess I should be more specific. When I said that it doesn't transfer across people, it's the actual encoding model that we fit, right? So these weights on the different units of the LSTM, that does not transfer across people. But that's a very sort of high resolution, detailed representation of like what's going on. If you go down to the, if you pull out some low dimensional thing like the time scale, right? If you just collapse this into one number, that's like, what's the time scale of each unit or of each voxel? That ends up quite consistent across people. So that's much more, reliably mappable. But it's also less interesting because that's one number and you can't use that to do all this fun stuff. So yeah, in terms of like how we could use this in the future to like not do more experiments that we don't need to do, not waste money like scanning more people, we do need this kind of data from some population, right? So we need like a collection of subjects for which we have enough data to actually fit these models. We fit the model within each individual subject, and then we can replicate all these experiments in those subjects virtually.
Yeah.
So that's the way we think about it.
Yeah.
There are also some interesting things that we found recently. So my student RJ Antonello just had a paper accepted at NeurIPS this year, and so we had originally just shown like a single subject result as part of that paper. As part of the review process, we ended up doing like a cross-subject analysis of saying like how reliable are these things across subjects. And really interestingly, what came out is that the single subject results, even if you look at each of the individual single subjects, are not that consistent with like what we'd expect based on the literature. But if you average them together, it looks exactly what you'd expect based on the literature. So I think there's a reckoning coming in this like part of cognitive neuroscience where there are a lot of things that are true in the group that are not true in the individual. Like the group average is not representative of the individual. The group average is like way off the manifold of the individuals. And I think that's interesting. So like doing what we do here with these individual, personalized models, I think that's going to be even more important when people sort of come to terms with this problem.
Cool.
Hey, just about the last thing that you said, I mean, you're telling me that someone's watching a movie and you can tell just from the fMRI scan, like what's going on in the movie. Is that right?
So we've done this before, but training on movies, right? So it's like, and actually the lab where I did my PhD, there was a paper that came out in 2011 by Shinji Nishimoto, where he showed you can actually reconstruct what the movie looks like. Like you can get a fuzzy, crappy version of the video that the person is watching from the fMRI data, like from their visual cortex. I had a paper in 2017 that showed that we can figure out what the categories are in a movie. So if somebody's watching a movie, we can decode is there a person in the scene? Is there a tree? Is there a mountain? Is there text? Whatever. We have 1,000 different categories that we tested, but that was all based on training these models on a bunch of people watching movie data. Here, what we did, and this was Jerry's idea, and I think it's brilliant, and it's turned out wildly cool, is we just took these models that we trained on people listening to stories. Right. In fact, in most of these cases, it's people listening to stories with their eyes closed. There's zero visual stimulation. There's nothing coming in. And then we had those same people just go in and watch a silent movie, like a 5-minute short film, and just ran the decoder on it as if they were listening to a story. And what comes out is a weirdly accurate kind of play-by-play of what's going on in the movie.
Oh,
if you have a little voice in your head that's like, oh no, don't go in there. That's kind of what comes out. It's wild.
Yeah, that sounds pretty incredible. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, Alex, thanks again for an awesome talk. Oh wait, there's another question, Shaban.
Sorry to cut us right at the very end when we're all ready to move on with our
No,
Fridays.
it's fine.
That's cool.
But I just wanted to sort of circle back to that, the individuality of the participants point that you noted, and sort of ask, and I do not mean to start a huge philosophical discussion. I think you might have heard my dog chiming in on this, by the way. So you are not alone, Alex. Pets are the best office mates, but
Always.
But seeing as what was defined as sort of normal for a brain, and I guess what I'm getting at is I'm thinking of, persons who have even mild traumatic brain injuries or things like that, where there might be some changes to the way they process language. Is that what you meant by how you controlled for a normal brain? Or were we talking a little bit more at that just higher level of there was no abnormal physical features of the brain when we're trying to, again, do that aggregate look at the participants, et cetera?
No, that's a really interesting question. So no, I didn't mean specifically abnormal brains or people's brains who brains from people who are suffering from mental illness or brain injury or anything like this. Certainly, we would expect people who have traumatic brain injury or anything that affects their brain and how it works, that the way that their brain works and responds to language and responds to stimuli will be a bit different than a random other person. What I'm talking about here is the fact that brains are different enough that if you try to average together multiple brains, so if you just try to take multiple healthy participant brains, take the images of these brains and try to average them together, this is not a well-posed problem. There is not necessarily a one-to-one mapping between one person's brain and another person's brain, which is an assumption that a lot of sort of methods of averaging make, that there is 1 point here maps to 1 point here. That is definitely not quite true. There is another assumption that a lot of people make, is that there is a diffeomorphic relationship. So if you have a couple, sorry, I need to put down the dog treats here. If you have a couple brain areas in one person's brain that are next to each other, then those brain areas should be next to each other in another person's brain. That's not even necessarily true. There's a lot of, especially when you get down to sort of finer grained sort of parcellations of brains, then oftentimes you can see things like swap places with other brain areas. It gets messy, which really makes it difficult to think about how would you how would you think of like a group average brain? Like, is that a thing that makes sense? And I'm not really sure it is. And I'm not sure that we really have the right tools for dealing with that yet.
That just because from again, limited research and experience in this area, it really doesn't, it seems like we just keep finding people map things completely differently, and then even they change right as they age, and so it's kind of, I mean, it's sad that it's lovely as we'd like to just extrapolate a model that would be so convenient, but it's I guess nice to see that this sort of what we're seem to be seeing, in, I guess, in real life, for lack of a better expression, is in fact mapping to what you're seeing with these modeling attempts. So thank you so much for sharing this, because it is still, though, very interesting how much you can pinpoint and pull out for a specific individual. And I think there's a lot of excellent applications there. So thank you again so much for your time and for this talk.
Oh, thank you, Siobhan.
Great. Well, yeah, I agree. Thanks for the talk. It's great. And I hope the
Thanks,
dog
Adam.
is still doing okay.
She calmed down. It was just that like 5 minutes at the beginning. It's perfect.
Okay.
Perfect timing.
Yeah, nice. Okay, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks, and thanks again for coming. Thanks, Alex.